Okay, remember that there changed my voice. This video is about Genesis 11 and how God judged the earth. He judged all the people of the earth together as a group. It's for my playlist about why it's fair to judge people as a group and also as individuals according to their deeds. Now, some people know already that it's fair, right? They knew the first time. It's very obvious. You know since a kid, right? What group do they attach themselves to? Who are they in that group? Pretty straightforward. But there are people who still are arguing that they're not all like that, or this, that, and the other thing, and they're trying to confuse the fact that their group is part of why they're guilty and why they and their offspring are being cut off. So we see in Genesis 11, we see that the peoples of the earth started rallying to Babylon. Okay, they weren't rallying to a righteous leader. They weren't rallying to the King of Kings. They were rallying to Babylon. That's what this story is about. One might argue, well, Jesus wasn't there at the time. That's irrelevant. The bottom line is they were rallying to do something evil and for themselves, not for God. They wanted to make a name for themselves. Okay, it's a very early example of idolatry in the Bible, where they wanted people to look up to people with their characteristics, their size and shape, their mentality, whatever worldly craft they're good at, maybe science, maybe art, maybe satanic sex. The Bible talks about how rebels like to try to be skilled in evil, right? When it says that the Jews in Isaiah, for example, or Jeremiah, what have you, that they're skilled in doing evil. So they wanted to make a name for themselves, which by default is evil. And so they were rebelling against God and His plan and His Spirit and what God considers intelligence and wisdom for what they consider intelligence and wisdom, like the intelligence agencies of the world, where they try to control people's conception of what is smart, what is success, what have you. And as a result, say in America, and I'm sure that Canada and Mexico and everywhere you can think of have basically the same conception. Like it's really here in North America, right? In Canada, Mexico, and America, people tend to use the same kind of terms when describing females, right? In their own language or whatever. Okay, they say females tend to be bitches, right? They say, they're bitches and hoes, and we're players or whatever. Now, why do they say that? Because the output of their system is so outrageous that even though their sisters and their mothers, etc., are being alluded to, they're so unhappy with themselves and with the way females turned out and with their lack of intelligence and insight that they say they're dumb hoes, they're dumb bitches. It's very clear here. I remember my ex-girlfriend, in fact, when I used to complain about how females treated me in life, she would say Mecca. She called me Mecca. It's short for my name, Chuko Mecca. Chuko Emeka, right? And she'd say, Mecca, it's because they're bitches, Mecca. Like, what don't you get kind of thing. And I brought this up before in my videos. Keep in mind that I understand the different types of females very, very well. Okay, but nobody understands to a T why females choose to be stupid, why the mass majority of males choose to be stupid, right? And as we look at it, it's a good example of judging people as a group, except for when we're talking about gender, it's not something that they can change. Not in reality. Sex changes don't really change your natural sex or gender. Whatever word you want to use. There's all kinds of weirdos with their, wordplay games, and that includes when we're talking about people's sexes or genders or whatever. So, when we look at females as a group, right? My mother is blameless because she brought me into this world, so we can say, hey, that person separated themselves from other females. So now we have two groups. One is my mother in her own category, and two is all the rest of the females on the planet who cheated me out of my right to lead. Okay, and some have treated me more fairly than others, so I therefore can judge them as a group. Okay, that group has failed, right? And I can judge them as individuals. When I'm at God's right hand, after my flesh dies, and it is judgment day in that way at that point in that sense. So what did God do when they started building a tower for themselves? He said, well, I'm going to confuse them, right? But that's not exactly what happened. They didn't actually say to each other across the board, hey, let's build this thing and do this, that, and the other thing. By their actions. So the laughable actions of their spirits and sub-spirits were communicating to each other, to each other's spirits, that they wish to be punks and rebel against God. They wish to be sissies and be like a gay person at a fashion show or something, or some scientist pretending to be ideal, or Da Vinci trying to pretend he's ideal, and they wanted to be complete idiots and pretend they're important and sexually abuse people and have weird geek face sex and so on and so forth. Instead of what God made it so that the wise person would do, right? Because righteousness and justice shows us what we should do. So they didn't want to be righteous or just. They wanted people to look up to them, and they wanted to create systems. And we see this with all the tribes and nations of the world, with maybe one exception, so to speak, right? All throughout history. And these days, I'm the only one really doing the right thing, mind you. We see that they decided to try to get people to look up to their chiefs, and they came up with their own stories, what have you. Now, why exactly that is, nobody knows. Okay, we don't know if they just did it because at some point they had wandered far away from Africa, and they, have forgotten what the Royal African Falcon Martial Art Order is, right? We don't know what was going on 100,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago, what have you. But we know that by their actions, they decided to do things a certain way. Thus, the purpose of the Bible, according to the Bible, was to preach the gospel around the world, so people who kind of found themselves in that situation could say, hey, that was a mistake. We should come into the one religion that God set apart for us, because wisdom walks in the way of righteousness along the path of justice. Proverbs 8, verse 20. And when we look at the world, we see a lot of people came into Luciferian deceptions under the guise of Christianity, right? The broad path to destruction, and some maintained their pagan ways and what have you. So what happened automatically when they rebelled is they were confused, because God did not make the world for people to self-direct like Freemasons. Like Freemasons, they're very confused. They don't know what they're doing. So they do these silly rituals and come into trance-like states. Okay, there's nothing about God's plan that makes it so that it's a good idea, and it's not a good idea to do something like that. So everyone thinks of them as very mature. Everyone calls them Luciferians. People talk about how much they hate them, and so they're an object of scorn and a byword, right? Freemasonry, like it's almost like a cuss word. It's like being called a bitch to be called a Freemason. These are the facts here. And so you got these guys in the government who think they should stick up for them, and they harass people if they say things like that at times, and sometimes they let people insult them based on what they're doing within the boundaries of being a sissy Luciferian. They maintain the Masonic doctrine. And that, Masonry is basically Luciferianism. I know I said in a way it's a little bit confusing, but to make a long story short, people get confused when they do not obey God through me. And I challenge you to name one person who isn't obeying God through me, who isn't confused, okay? And when I say confused, I mean past a certain point. What are they doing in life? What's Trump doing in life, right? What is, the Prime Minister of Canada? What is the President of Mexico? What is, the President of Ethiopia or whatever, right? What are they doing? What is Bibi Netanyahu doing? What is Elon Musk? What is the average person walking down the streets? They're just like lemmings, right? On the broad path to destruction. They don't know what they're doing. Now they like to play a game and say, well, let's play this game so we can self-direct and pretend like we're honoring God and act like it's no hard feelings. We just want to be in charge. But that's a bitch move. Because the Lord is a warrior, right? The Lord is the Father. He is the point of reference for being a man. Righteousness, justice, wisdom, right? Be perfect and try to be like God by obeying God through me. They didn't do that. So instead they're trying to be like the devil, who's like a little bitch. Now how do we know the devil's a little bitch? And I'm not just saying this because I hate the devil, but how do we know that that's the case? Well, the devil is a character in the Bible, for example, right? And in the Bible, which is by Baal, which is basically by the devil, you have the word El in devil, and El is one of the Baals, aka one of the Baals. Babylon, Baal on, and Babylon's Baal, son, right? Ons because sons scrambled. So how do we know the devil's a bitch? Well, in Proverbs, it says folly is an unruly woman, right? She's simple and knows nothing, right? She's confused, right? She's like a dumb, scatterbrained bitch. And we see it also says that folly's in the heart of a child. So what happens when you combine the idea of folly being a child with the idea of folly being an unruly woman, aka a bitch? And Christ is a character in the story saying he did not come for the dogs when speaking to the Canaanite woman, not because of her race, but because of her path, her state of being, what have you. Well, you get that the devil is a little bitch, a little unruly female, a dog, a little unruly female dog, a little bitch. So when people are like, I want to rebel, I'll do it my way, they look dumber than Mitch McConnell on his worst day. They look so stupid.